Grace to and peace from God our Creator and Christ our Redeemer. Please be seated. The first church that I served, St. Paul's on the Green in Norwalk, is a lovely stone church done in the style of an English country parish. One of the interesting things about that church was the way that the way in which people would react to the building. I've never been able to identify exactly what aspect of that place so affected people, whether it was the deep hues of the stained glass that painted the interior with rich colors, or the way that sunbeams would spill through the upper windows, casting vivid fingers of light across the motes of dust. Perhaps it was the gentle, lingering smell of incense, or a sense of stillness afforded by thick walls and the tall trees that surrounded it. It could even have been a sense of permanence created by the immensity of the heavy stones of which it was built, or the timelessness created by the countless old stones of the cemetery that surrounded it. In reality, it was probably some combination of all these things that touched people. Indeed, that church building seemed to match some deeply rooted idea of what a church should look like. It was as if it was the embodiment of the archetype of church buildings. And the effect of the building could not be ignored. Visitors were awed by it, and I remember one woman who had an actual religious experience when she first saw the building and entered it, absent of any worship service or music or other people. When people see that church building, they expect to encounter God there, and they become more receptive to God's presence. There are certain places where people assume that they will find God. It should come as no surprise that churches are high on the list, but they're not alone on it. People expect to find God in the natural world, amid a forest filled with towering trees that arch into green, great cathedral-like canopies, or in the muted colors and the sparseness of the desert, or looking out over the vast and endless seas. But there are other places as well, pilgrimage sites, or hospitals, or even sometimes the kitchen table. By extension, there are also places where we don't expect to find God. I can honestly say that I don't expect to find God while going through the border crossing checkpoint. I also don't look for God while waiting to get my oil changed. I have certainly never expected to encounter the divine amid the bureaucracy and lines of a Service Canada office. Because there's nothing holy about these mundane and profane places that would cause me to anticipate God. If I were to find God in them, it would be a shocking experience. I believe that is the state in which we find Jacob in today's reading from Genesis. As a bit of background, where we pick up the story today, Jacob is on the run. Jacob has run away from his childhood home, away from the loving arms of his mother, and away from his brother Esau, who is filled with anger and wrath towards Jacob. Now, to be fair, the fury towards Jacob is well earned, for he has tricked his elder brother Esau out of his birthright, as well as the blessing of their dying father Isaac. Jacob is fleeing for his life and running through the wilderness and the empty places on his way back to the ancestral lands of Abraham and Sarah. When the darkness of night forces him to stop and rest, he is alone and far from the lands to which God has promised his ancestors. He is far from the lands of his God. He has no reason to expect to find God here. To Jacob, this is a godless place. We can understand his shock, therefore, when Jacob has a fantastic vision of God in his sleep. In his dream, Jacob stood before a great ladder or staircase that stretched up into the heavens, and upon it Jacob watched with wonder as angels ascended and descended between heaven and earth, carrying out work known only to God. As Jacob watches the scene, God stands beside him, or perhaps over him, as with dreams, translations are not always exact, and assures Jacob that God will be with him always and will not forget the promises that God has made to Jacob and his ancestors. Jacob's shock is twofold, for not only is God present in this empty and seemingly godless place, but God is actively working in countless and unfathomable ways. Surely God is in this place, and I did not know it, Jacob cries upon his waking. Even here, you are with me, he seems to say. It's an important point in the development of the faith of God's people because it is one of the early signs that Yahweh, the God of Abraham and Sarah, is not like the gods of other nations. This God, our God, is not bound by place or human expectation. There is no place, no land, no thing which we can call godless. It is not possible to be without God. Even here, God is with us. While this concept's not as radical today as it would have once been, it is nonetheless something which we need reminding of, because there are places and times when we don't expect to find God. Places and times when we would be quite surprised if we encountered God. Sometimes it's because they've formed the routine of daily life, those unvarying patterns of our lives that cause our minds and our attention to wander. They distract us, maybe even disillusion us. We've sat and stared at stoplights and moved through grocery checkout lines and have been asked for spare change on street corners so many countless times that the experiences seem in no way holy. Why would we find God here? Why would we even look for God here? Besides, we have so many other things with which to occupy our attention. Even here, God is with us. Sometimes we need reminding because we get so overwhelmed with fear, the fear of loss and death, or even grief over that which has already been lost and those who have already died. The hole inside of us that fear and that grief creates can seem so great, so profound, so empty, that it's hard, maybe even impossible, to imagine that anything could be present in it, much less fill it. Even here, God is with us. Other times we need this reminder because the uncertainty of the future threatens to overwhelm us, whether by loss of job or loss of health or loss of a loved one. Our lives can take sudden turns that leave us spinning. And in a moment, what was once before us and seemed so certain can disappear, leaving us wondering what happened to the blessings we once thought we had. As we cast about, drifting in this uncertainty like a ship without rudder, we ask, what could possibly give us direction now? Who could possibly find us here so far from where we once thought we were? Even here, God is with us. As you may recall, I arrived here at St. Faith's in the midst of the pandemic, which means that I left my last parish in the midst of the pandemic. It was a strange time. Like so many of us, I was working from home most of the time, but about once a week, I would drive down to my parish to do things like check the mail and walk around the property. I would always stop in the sanctuary to check on things, to make sure that the windows were still closed. I don't know who I thought would open them, but I checked nonetheless. I would just go in and make sure it was all still okay. One day, as I walked through the dimly lit space, I hadn't even bothered to turn on the lights, it hit me that as best as I could figure, this was the longest that sanctuary had been empty since it was built. Pausing in the pews, I was surrounded by all the trappings of church worship, all the things I had been trained to do, all the things that had played such a large part in my own prayer and worship life, and it was gone. It was a strange thing, and it was a similar reality when I arrived here. Even as we gathered every week online, it was a strange thing to sit in this sanctuary by myself as we worshiped. It would have been so easy to feel despair over how much had been lost to us, over how far we felt from the places and the rhythms that we knew. And yet, even then, in the midst of that pandemic diaspora, God was with us. Even in the face of empty church pews and countless Zoom windows, God was with us. Even as we navigated an entirely new way of being and an entirely new world, God was with us. Even here, God is with us. That is the good news of Jacob's witness. Even in the places we least expect to find God, in the places that seem so empty and devoid of God, God is here. It's not just that God is here, though. It's more than that. Even in these places that seem so far from God, so out of the way and on the edge, Jacob reveals to us that they are, in fact, the center of God's kingdom, the center of God's house, the center of God's activity. Even here, God is with us, but not just with us. God is active and at work. The good news of Jacob's witness is that God is building the kingdom even here. That God is repairing the wounds of the world and bringing reconciliation and healing where there's brokenness, and that God will keep God's promise to us. Jacob's good news is also a challenge. It's a challenge for us to remember God's promise and to expect God's presence in the world around us. It's a challenge to us as a people to remember in times of great uncertainty and fear. It's a challenge to us as individuals to remember in the face of loss and grief and the unknown. It's a challenge to us to remember in the trivial and routine actions of our daily lives that even here, God is at work. It is a challenge to remember. So we must remind ourselves often, and we must remind one another, strengthening one another when we feel down and lost. We must remember and live in the expectation that even here, God is with us.